Have you ever imagined what it would be like to wake up one day and discover that everything you believed about justice and honesty was just an illusion? Anthony Smith, a 19-year-old who worked part-time at a gas station to help his mother pay the bills, was about to find out in the most brutal way possible. In Cedar Falls, a small Iowa town where everyone knows everyone and secrets are currency at the corner store, Anthony lived a simple but dignified life, dreaming of a college scholarship that would change his family's destiny forever. He believed that honest work and dedication to his studies were enough to build a better future, but he was about to learn that in a world where money and influence dictate the rules, innocence can become a person's greatest vulnerability. On the other side of town, in a mansion that looked like a movie set, lived Bradley Harrison, the mayor's son, and everything Anthony wasn't. While Anthony counted quarters to buy lunch at school, Bradley blew fortunes on parties fueled by drugs and alcohol, protected by his father's political influence. It was a stark contrast that revealed the two faces of Cedar Falls. On one side, hard-working people fighting for dignity. On the other, a corrupt elite that believed it was above the law. When a brutal crime shattered the town's tranquility, these two worlds were about to collide in a way no one could predict. The injustice that followed would be so shocking that it would change not only Anthony's life, but reveal the rot hiding behind the respectable facade of a seemingly peaceful community. What happened that fateful night in Cedar Falls was just the beginning of a conspiracy that went far beyond anyone's imagination. Evidence was manipulated, witnesses changed their testimonies after friendly conversations, and the truth was systematically buried by those who should have protected it. Anthony found himself at the center of a hurricane of lies and corruption, fighting not just for his own freedom, but for the soul of his community. Each passing day, the trap closed tighter around him, and he began to realize he was facing forces much larger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. It was an unequal fight between an honest young man and an entire system determined to destroy him, a battle where the weapons were truth against lies, justice against corruption. Get ready for a journey that will stir your deepest emotions, that will make you question everything you believe about justice and power. This is a story about how injustice can destroy innocent lives, but also about the extraordinary strength that emerges when someone refuses to accept defeat. You'll feel anger, outrage, compassion, and a thirst for revenge that will grow with each shocking revelation, because sometimes the most impactful stories are those that show us how corruption can spread like a virus, infecting even the institutions that should protect us. But they also remind us that truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to surface. And when it does, the consequences can be devastating for those who thought they were safe in their ivory towers. You know that feeling of waking up every day knowing exactly what awaits you? That's how Anthony Smith lived in Cedar Falls, a small Iowa town where everyone knows everyone and secrets are currency at the corner grocery store. At 19, this young man had a routine that many would consider monotonous, but for him it represented dignity and hope. While other kids his age were worried about parties and social media, Anthony split his time between his senior year textbooks and the gas station where he worked part-time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and that meant everything to him and his mother, Amelia. The woman had raised her son alone, working as a cleaner in various places around town, always with that tired but loving smile that only a warrior mom has. Anthony knew that every dollar he earned at the station was another brick in building the dream they both shared, a college scholarship. It was his chance to break the cycle of poverty that had haunted the family for generations, and he was willing to make any sacrifice to achieve it. On the other side of town, in a mansion that looked like a movie set, lived Bradley Harrison. While Anthony counted quarters to buy lunch at school, Bradley spent in one night what the Smith family didn't see in months. Son of Mayor Robert Harrison, the 20-year-old had everything money could buy, but it never seemed to be enough. Exclusive parties were just the beginning of his list of excesses. Expensive drugs, imported cars, and an arrogance you could feel from a mile away completed the package. The most infuriating part, whenever Bradley got into trouble, and there were plenty of times, Daddy Mayor would find a way to cover it all up. It was as if the rules didn't apply to him, as if he were untouchable. While Anthony busted his back studying to get an opportunity, Bradley wasted everyone that fell into his lap. The injustice was glaring, but nobody dared question it. After all, who messes with the son of the most powerful man in town? The difference between the two wasn't just about social class, it was about character. Anthony had that genuine humility of someone who knows the value of things, while Bradley reeked of the arrogance of someone who never had to fight for anything. At the gas station, Anthony treated every customer with respect, always with a sincere good morning and a smile that came from the heart. Bradley, well, he saw people as pieces on a board, useful only when convenient. It was amazing how two young men the same age living in the same town could be so different. One was building his future with his own hands, brick by brick, while the other destroyed opportunities like throwing paper in the trash. Anthony dreamed of the day he could give his mother a better life, maybe buy a little house of their own, maybe even help help other young people like him. Bradley, his dreams didn't go beyond the next party, the next irresponsible adventure, the next way to spend money that wasn't even his. The gas station where Anthony worked was on Main Street, Cedar Falls' main drag, a busy spot where he watched the town's life pass before his eyes. It was there that he observed the stark differences between people, the luxury cars that stopped to fill up, driven by those who never had to worry about gas prices, and the old pickup trucks of farmers who counted every dollar before deciding how much to put in the tank. Anthony identified with the latter, of course. He understood the look of someone calculating whether it's better to fill up or buy bread for breakfast. This harsh reality motivated him even more to study, to dedicate himself, to not give up on his college dream. Every book he opened, every test he took, was a step away from that life of limitations. Not that he was ashamed of his origins. On the contrary, he was proud of his family's struggle. But he knew that education was the key to opening doors that seemed eternally closed to people like him. Amelia, meanwhile, was the type of woman who inspires without even realizing it. She woke up before sunrise, prepared simple but lovingly made coffee, and left for another day of hard work. Her calloused hands told the story of a lifetime dedicated to her son, and Anthony knew it. There wasn't a single day when he didn't feel grateful to have such a warrior mother. She never complained, never showed fatigue in front of him, always with that sweet way of finding strength in love. "Son, we may not have much, but we have what matters," she always said, and Anthony believed that with all his heart. They had dignity, they had love, they had dreams, and that was worth more than any mansion or imported car. The connection between mother and son was so strong it didn't need words. One look was enough for them to understand each other completely. Meanwhile, at the Harrison mansion, the atmosphere was quite different. Robert Harrison, the mayor, was one of those politicians who talk pretty in public, but make dirty deals behind the scenes. He had built an empire of favors and influences that kept the family at the top of Cedar Falls' social pyramid. Bradley was the perfect reflection of this upbringing, spoiled, irresponsible, and convinced that the world owed him everything. The boy had never worked a single day in his life, never felt the weight of responsibility, never learned the value of effort. It was as if he lived in a bubble, protected from the consequences of his actions by the surname he carried. And the worst part? He knew it and abused that protection without any shame. The parties he threw were legendary in town, not for good reasons, but for the excesses and the certainty that nothing bad would happen to him, no matter what he did. The town of Cedar Falls seemed divided into two parallel worlds that rarely crossed paths. On one side, people like Anthony and Amelia, who fought day after day to achieve a better life, who valued every small victory and believed in the power of honest work. On the other, the local elite, represented by the Harrisons and their allies, who lived in a reality where the rules were different, where money and influence bought not only luxuries but also impunity. It was a silent injustice, accepted by many as the way things are, but it deeply bothered those who had eyes to see. Anthony felt this firsthand, especially when he saw Bradley driving down Main Street, always speeding, always with that face of someone who thinks he owns the world. But the young worker had no idea that this difference between worlds would soon become the center of a nightmare that would change his life forever. Something was about to happen that would put these two universes on a collision course in a way no one could predict. It was an ordinary Tuesday in Cedar Falls, one of those that goes unnoticed on life's calendar. Anthony had finished his shift at the station at 10 p.m., as he always did, putting away the keys and checking that everything was in order before heading home. The night was cool, typical of Iowa autumn, and he walked through the empty streets thinking about the next day's math test. He had no idea that just a few blocks away, Bradley Harrison was leaving another of his parties fueled by alcohol and substances that cost more than the Smith family's monthly salary. The mayor's son was driving zigzag through town, with that sense of invincibility that only someone who has never faced real consequences can have. He was a walking time bomb, and Cedar Falls was about to feel the impact of the explosion. While Anthony dreamed of a better future, Bradley was creating a nightmare that would destroy innocent lives. The irony of fate is sometimes cruel. Two young men, two paths, one single night that would change everything. Around 11:30 p.m., Miller's Corner convenience store, a family establishment that had served the community for over 20 years, became the scene of a brutal crime that would shock the entire town. The owner, Mr. Edward Miller, a 58-year-old man known for his kindness and generosity, was found unconscious behind the counter with severe head injuries. The place was ransacked, the cash register money was gone, and security cameras captured only a hooded figure, impossible to identify clearly. It was the type of crime that didn't happen in Cedar Falls, a town where people still left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors. The violence of the assault left everyone in shock. It wasn't a simple robbery, but something that carried inexplicable inexplicable rage, a brutality that made no sense. Mr. Miller was rushed to the hospital fighting for his life, while police began an investigation that would soon take unexpected and unjust turns. The first witness to come forward was Margaret Thompson, a 67-year-old woman who lived near the store and claimed to have seen Anthony Smith in the vicinity of the establishment around the time of the crime. Margaret had always been a respected person in the community, known for her sharp memory and honesty, which gave immediate weight to her testimony. She described seeing a young man who looked like Amelia's son walking hurriedly down the street, looking over his shoulder as if fleeing from something. The problem was that Margaret had been wearing outdated prescription glasses for years and the street lighting wasn't the best, but these details were conveniently ignored by the investigation. Community pressure for quick answers was enormous. After all, if a crime like this could happen to beloved Mr. Miller, nobody was safe. They needed to find a culprit, and Anthony, unfortunately, was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or at least that's how it seemed. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Bradley Harrison was at a party at the Whitmore mansion, surrounded by influential friends who would later confirm his presence with suspicious precision. The party had started early and extended into the early morning hours, with drugs, alcohol, and all sorts of excesses that characterized the gatherings of Cedar Falls' young elite. Bradley was visibly altered, mixing substances in a dangerous and irresponsible way, but this was considered normal in his social circle. What nobody knew was that he had left the party for a few hours, precisely during the period when the crime occurred, but his friends were willing to swear that he had never left the property. It was a collective lie, orchestrated not necessarily out of malice, but from the blind loyalty that money and influence can buy. Truth was a luxury they couldn't afford to reveal. The police investigation began with suspicious haste, as if there was already a predefined script to follow. The chief detective, a man close to Mayor Harrison, immediately focused on Anthony, ignoring other possibilities and clues that could lead to different suspects. The questions asked of the young man were loaded with accusation from the start, as if his guilt were an established fact that just needed to be confirmed. Where were you at 11:30 p.m.? Why were you walking down that street? Did you know Mr. Miller? Each question was a trap. Each answer was interpreted as evidence of guilt. Anthony responded with his usual honesty, explaining that he had left work and walked home as he did every night, but his simplicity was seen as suspicious. It was as if being poor and on the street at night was crime enough to justify an accusation. The injustice of the process was glaring, but nobody seemed willing to question the methods being used. What was most revolting was the difference in treatment between the two young men. While Anthony was subjected to aggressive and invasive interrogations, Bradley wasn't even called to give a statement, despite having a history of violent behavior when under the influence of substances. The investigation into the mayor's son amounted to an informal, almost cordial conversation where his alibis were accepted without question. It was as if there were two justices in Cedar Falls, one for those who had money and influence, another for those who depended only on their own honesty to defend themselves. Anthony felt anger growing inside him, not just from the unjust accusation, but from the clear perception that the system was rigged against him from the beginning. It was a bitter lesson about how the world really worked, very different from the ideals of justice he had learned in school. Each passing day, the trap closed tighter around him, and he began to realize that his innocence might not be enough to save him. The pressure on the Smith family increased each day, with suspicious looks from neighbors and malicious comments that reached Amelia's ears at work. The woman, who had always been respected in the community, now faced the humiliation of having her son accused of such a heinous crime. It was as if a shadow had fallen over their lives, transforming their simple but dignified routine into a constant nightmare. Anthony saw his mother's suffering and felt a mixture of sadness and revolt that threatened to consume him from within. He knew he was innocent, but began to realize that innocence was no guarantee of anything in a world where lies had more power than truth. The young man who dreamed of a college scholarship was now fighting not to lose his freedom, and the injustice of this situation was like poison spreading throughout the community. Something needed to be done. Someone needed to see beyond appearances, but Anthony had no idea that there were people willing to fight for the truth, even when it meant facing the powerful of Cedar Falls. In the weeks following the crime were like watching a poorly rehearsed play where everyone knew their roles except Anthony. The investigation moved forward with suspicious speed, as if there was a rush to close the case before someone asked the right questions. Evidence began appearing almost magically. A witness who remembered more details, an object that was found near the Smith house, testimonies that became more precise with each new version. Anthony watched all of this with a mixture of disbelief and terror, realizing he was being deliberately framed by a system that should have have protected him. Each day, the trap closed tighter around him, and he began to understand that his fight wasn't just against a false accusation, but against a well-oiled machine of lies determined to destroy him. It was like being trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up, where reality was being twisted in cruel and relentless ways. The most shocking moment came when Anthony discovered that the security footage from the gas station, which would have definitively proven his alibi, had mysteriously disappeared. The manager, Mr. Peterson, a man who had always been kind to Anthony, now avoided his gaze and mumbled unconvincing excuses about a technical problem that had corrupted the files. It was a lie, and everyone knew it, but nobody had the courage to speak the truth. Anthony felt deep rage growing in his chest. It wasn't just the injustice of the situation, but the cowardice of people he considered friends. It was like discovering that his entire life had been built on quicksand, and now everything was crumbling around him. The sense of betrayal was almost as painful as the accusation itself, because it revealed how willing people were to sacrifice truth for convenience. The young man who had always believed in human goodness was learning a bitter lesson about how fear and influence can corrupt even the purest souls. It was in this moment of despair that a ray of hope appeared in the form of Detective Lisa Rodriguez, an experienced investigator who had recently been transferred to Cedar Falls. Lisa had that sharp instinct that only comes with years of experience on complex cases, and something about Anthony's case didn't align with her sense of justice. She began asking the questions nobody else was asking. Why did evidence appear so conveniently? Why weren't certain leads being investigated? Why was there such a rush to close a case that deserved more attention to detail? Lisa was the type of cop who believed truth always leaves traces, and she was determined to follow those traces no matter where they led her. Her arrival in town hadn't gone unnoticed by the Harrisons, who were already beginning to feel uncomfortable with the unnecessary questions she was asking. It was the beginning of a parallel investigation that would soon become a serious problem for those trying to manipulate justice. Meanwhile, local media had transformed Anthony into the perfect villain for the narrative the town needed. The newspapers, controlled by Mayor Harrison's allies, painted the young man as a potential delinquent, someone who had chosen the wrong path despite the opportunities life had offered him. It was a cruel inversion of reality. Anthony, who had always been an example of dedication and honesty, was now portrayed as everything he never was. The articles talked about troubled youth and the importance of making right choices, as if poverty were a moral failing rather than a circumstance. Bradley, on the other hand, when mentioned, was always described as a promising young man of the community, someone who represented Cedar Falls' bright future. The hypocrisy was so glaring, it would have been comical if it weren't tragic. Anthony read these articles with a mixture of anger and disbelief, realizing how truth could be distorted when powerful interests were at stake. The psychological pressure on Anthony was immense, but what hurt him most was seeing his mother's suffering. Amelia had lost weight, slept poorly, and walked through town with her head down, carrying the weight of humiliation she didn't deserve. Other cleaning ladies at work whispered when she passed by, and some clients even made malicious comments about raising criminal children. It was silent torture that corroded the soul of the warrior woman who had always faced life with her head held high. Anthony saw all of this and felt terrible guilt, even knowing he was innocent. It was as if his mere existence had become a burden for the person he loved most in the world. The injustice of the situation was multiplied by the suffering it caused to someone who had nothing to do with the crime. Every tear he saw in his mother's eyes was like a stab to the heart, and he swore to himself that he would find a way to prove his innocence, not just for himself, but for her. Detective Rodriguez, meanwhile, was discovering inconsistencies that made her increasingly suspicious. Witnesses changed important details of their testimonies when questioned more deeply. Physical evidence didn't align perfectly with the official narrative, and there were gaps in the investigation that seemed intentional. She had seen similar cases before. When there's political pressure to solve a crime quickly, truth is often sacrificed for convenience. Lisa began investigating on her own, revisiting the crime scene, interviewing witnesses more thoroughly, and looking for clues that had been ignored. It was dangerous work because it directly questioned the competence and honesty of her colleagues, but she couldn't stand by and watch an innocent young man be destroyed by a corrupt system. Each discovery convinced her more that Anthony was being used as a scapegoat, and she was determined to prove it, even if it cost her career. The web of lies was becoming increasingly complex, involving not just the police but also local politicians, influential businessmen, and even some members of the media. It was as if all of Cedar Falls' elite had united in a silent pact to protect their own interests, even if it meant destroying an innocent young man's life. Anthony began to realize that his fight wasn't just against a false accusation, but against an entire system determined to keep him in the place they considered appropriate for someone of his social class. Each passing day, he felt anger growing inside him, not just from the injustice he was suffering, but from the perception that there were other people like him being silenced and oppressed by those who should protect them. It was a painful revelation about the true nature of power and corruption, but it was also planting the seeds of a determination that would soon become unstoppable. Something was about to happen that would change the course of this entire story, and Anthony had no idea that the truth was closer than he imagined. The day Anthony was formally charged and arrested felt like the world had collapsed on his head. The cold handcuffs on his wrists were the physical symbol of an injustice that had grown like a malignant tumor, spreading through every aspect of his life. He looked at his mother's face in the courtroom and saw there a pain that no words could describe. It was the suffering of a woman who had dedicated her entire life to raising an honest son, only to see him being destroyed by lies and manipulations. The formal charges brought with them the possibility of decades in prison, a future Anthony had never imagined even in his worst nightmares. The young man who dreamed of graduating from college now faced the prospect of growing old behind bars, paying for a crime he hadn't committed. It was a cruel twist of fate that tested not only his innocence, but his faith in humanity and justice. The rage he felt was almost suffocating, mixed with despair that threatened to consume him completely. The Cedar Falls community divided in a way that revealed the true character of its inhabitants. On one side were those who knew Anthony and his family, who knew the young man's character, and refused to believe the accusations. They were mainly simple people like him, workers, small business owners, neighbors who had watched the young man grow up with dignity and respect. On the other side was the portion of the population that preferred to believe the official version, whether out of convenience, fear, or simply because it was easier to accept that the poor kid had chosen the path of crime. It was painful to see how people could be influenced by social position and prejudices, ignoring obvious evidence in favor of narratives that confirmed their own biases. Anthony felt a mixture of gratitude for those who believed in him and deep disappointment with those who had abandoned him. It was a bitter lesson about human nature and how injustice can reveal both the best and worst in people. The Smith family's financial situation became desperate when they realized they didn't have the resources to hire a competent attorney. The public defender assigned to the case was an overworked and unmotivated man who barely had time to read the file before the first hearing. It was evident that Anthony was at a disadvantage from the start. While the prosecution had unlimited resources and political support, he depended on a public defense system that functioned more as a formality than as true legal protection. Amelia desperately tried to raise money, even considering selling the house, but even that wouldn't be enough to compete with the legal machine being used against her son. It was a clear demonstration of how justice could be bought, how money determined not only comfort but also freedom. Anthony saw his mother's desperation and felt terrible guilt, even knowing he was the victim of a conspiracy. It was as if his mere existence had become a financial and emotional burden for the only person who truly mattered in his life. It was during one of the most difficult prison visits that Anthony received the information that would change everything. Jake Miller, an old school friend who had distanced himself since the accusations began, appeared nervous and visibly disturbed. Jake had grown up in the same neighborhood as Anthony, but had gotten a scholarship to study at the private school where Bradley attended, which gave him access to the local elite's social circles. With a trembling voice and constantly looking over his shoulder, Jake revealed what he had discovered. During a party at the Harrison mansion, he had heard Bradley confessing the crime to a group of close friends, boasting about how he had managed to pin the blame on the poor kid. It was a clear and detailed confession, where Bradley described not only how he had committed the crime, but also how he had manipulated evidence to frame Anthony. Jake had been shocked by the revelation, but it took weeks for him to find the courage to tell the truth, knowing it would mean facing the wrath of the Harrisons and the entire local elite. Jake's revelation hit Anthony like a punch to the stomach, not just because of the confirmation that he was being deliberately framed, but because of the realization that Bradley had turned his destruction into entertainment. It was a cruelty that went beyond the crime itself, a demonstration of how the privileged could toy with the lives of the less fortunate without any remorse. Anthony felt a rage he had never experienced before, a fury that threatened to consume him completely. But along with the rage came renewed hope. Finally, there was concrete proof of his innocence, a way to expose the truth and seek the justice that had been denied him. The problem was how to use this information without putting Jake in danger, and without it being simply covered up by the same system that had created the initial injustice. Anthony realized he needed to be strategic, that truth alone wouldn't be enough if it wasn't presented in the right way at the right time. The dilemma Anthony faced was immense: how to prove his innocence against a system determined to keep him guilty. Jake was willing to testify, but both knew this would mean facing not just Bradley, but the entire political and social machine that protected him. It was David versus Goliath, but without the certainty that the stone would find its target. Anthony spent sleepless nights in his cell, planning strategies, thinking of ways to expose the truth without putting more people at risk. He knew he had only one chance, that if he failed, he would not only lose his freedom but also destroy the lives of those who dared to help him. The pressure was immense, but the injustice he was suffering had forged in him a determination that hadn't existed before. It was as if the young worker had died in prison, and in his place a fighter had been born, someone willing to face any obstacle in pursuit of truth. Revenge wasn't his goal. It was justice, pure and simple, the right to clear his name and his family's. Detective Rodriguez, meanwhile, was reaching the same conclusions through different paths. Her parallel investigations had revealed inconsistencies so glaring they were impossible to ignore. She had discovered that Bradley didn't have a solid alibi for the night of the crime, that several witnesses had changed their testimonies after conversations with people connected to the mayor, and that important evidence had been ignored or destroyed. Lisa knew she was treading on dangerous ground, that questioning the official investigation meant challenging not just her superiors, but the entire local establishment. But she couldn't stand by and watch an innocent young man be destroyed by a corrupt system. It was a matter of principle, of everything she believed in as a police officer and as a human being. The detective was about to make a decision that would change not only her career, but Anthony's fate and that of the entire city of Cedar Falls. The truth was about to come to light, but the price would be high for everyone involved. Anthony's attempt to use Jake's testimony to prove his innocence quickly turned into an even greater nightmare. Within 48 hours of Jake agreeing to testify, the young man received a friendly visit from some local thugs who made it clear that his safety and his family's depended on him forgetting what he had heard at the party. Jake, terrified and without resources to protect himself, backed down from his decision and even went so far as to deny that he had spoken to Anthony about any confession. It was like watching the last hope fade before his eyes, like seeing truth being strangled by corruption's dirty hands. Anthony felt deep rage growing in his chest, not just from Jake's cowardice, but from the realization that the system was willing to use any method to silence the truth. It was a clear demonstration that injustice wasn't just a mistake, but a deliberate choice by those who had power to protect their own interests. The feeling of powerlessness was almost unbearable, like being trapped in a spider's web where every movement only entangled him more deeply. Detective Rodriguez discovered in the worst possible way that her parallel investigations hadn't gone unnoticed. During an apparently routine meeting, her supervisor informed her that she was being transferred to another district to better utilize her skills on more complex cases. It was a poorly disguised lie, and everyone in the room knew it. Lisa had become a problem for very powerful people, and the simplest solution was to remove her from the board before she caused more damage. The detective felt a mixture of rage and frustration that threatened to explode. She was so close to exposing the truth, so close to achieving justice, and now she was being silenced in the most cowardly way possible. It was a bitter lesson about how the system protected itself, about how those who dared question the official narrative were quickly neutralized. But Lisa Rodriguez wasn't the type of person who gave up easily, and her forced transfer only fueled her determination to find a way to expose the corruption, even if it cost her career. The consequences of Anthony's fight for truth spread like ripples in a pond, affecting all those who dared support him. Amelia lost her cleaning job at City Hall suddenly, and without convincing explanation, leaving the family in an even more desperate financial situation. The few neighbors who had publicly defended Anthony began facing small retaliations, unexpected fines, problems with business licenses, bureaucratic difficulties that appeared out of nowhere. It was a systematic intimidation campaign that showed how far the Harrisons were willing to go to protect their secrets. Anthony watched all of this from prison with terrible guilt, realizing that his fight for justice was causing suffering to innocent people who were just trying to do the right thing. It was as if his mere existence had become toxic, contaminating all those who came near him. The injustice of the situation was multiplied by the fact that the people who most needed protection were precisely those being punished for supporting the truth. But not all was lost, because Mayor Harrison's desperate actions to cover up the case began attracting unwanted attention. Amanda Foster, an experienced investigative journalist who worked for a state newspaper, had noticed a strange pattern in news coming from Cedar Falls: sudden transfers of public officials, a criminal case that had been resolved with suspicious speed, and rumors of intimidation that reached her ears through confidential sources. Amanda had that sharp instinct that only comes with years of experience, uncovering stories others preferred to keep hidden. She knew that when local authorities worked so hard to keep something secret, there was usually a good reason to investigate more deeply. Amanda's arrival in Cedar Falls didn't go unnoticed, but this time the Harrisons faced someone who wasn't under their direct influence, someone who had resources and connections to resist local pressure. Amanda's investigation began discreetly, but soon she realized she she had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple case of injustice. The inconsistencies in Anthony's case were so glaring they were embarrassing. The employee transfers followed a pattern suggesting political interference, and there was evidence of a corruption network that went far beyond a single crime. Amanda was the type of journalist who didn't intimidate easily, who had faced corrupt politicians and dishonest businessmen throughout her career. She knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but she also knew there was an important story to be told, an injustice that needed to be exposed. The journalist began building a network of confidential sources, including disgruntled public employees, police officers with guilty consciences, and ordinary citizens who were tired of local corruption. It was meticulous and dangerous work, but Amanda was determined to get to the bottom of the truth. Detective Rodriguez, even after her forced transfer, couldn't forget Anthony's case. The injustice she had witnessed bothered her deeply, and she knew she had valuable information that could help expose the truth. It was through discreet channels that she managed to make contact with Amanda Foster, providing the journalist with documents and evidence she had collected during her parallel investigation. It was a huge risk to her career, but Lisa couldn't live with a guilty conscience knowing she had the power to help an innocent young man. The alliance between the transferred detective and the investigative journalist created a powerful force against local corruption, a combination of inside knowledge and external resources that the Harrisons hadn't anticipated. It was as if all the pieces of a complex puzzle were finally fitting together, forming a clear picture of the injustice that had been perpetrated. Meanwhile, Anthony remained in prison, watching his life and his family's being systematically destroyed by forces that seemed impossible to fight. The rage he felt had transformed into something deeper, a cold and calculated determination to survive this ordeal and find a way to expose the truth. He knew he was being used as a pawn in a much larger game, that his destruction was just collateral damage from the crimes and lies of powerful people. But Anthony had also learned something important during these terrible months, that injustice only prevails when good people remain silent, and that truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to surface. The young man who had entered prison as a victim was transforming into something different, a symbol of resistance against corruption, proof that not even the most powerful can completely silence those who fight for justice. Something was about to happen that would change everything, and Anthony could feel it in the air like the calm before the storm. The turning point came when Anthony was at his most desperate, about to accept a plea deal that would sentence him to years in prison for a crime he hadn't committed. His public defender, overworked and under-resourced, had practically convinced him it was the only possible way out given the mountain of fabricated evidence against him. It was like being at the bottom of a dark well, unable to see any light at the end of the tunnel, when Amanda Foster obtained the definitive proof that would change everything. Through an anonymous source, later discovered to be a Harrison Mansion employee with a guilty conscience, she obtained an audio recording where Bradley confessed to the crime in detail, laughing about how he had managed to pin the blame on the poor kid. The recording was crystal clear, impossible to contest or discredit, and contained details of the crime that only the real perpetrator could know. It was the proof Anthony had dreamed of having, the evidence that would finally expose the entire network of lies and corruption that had destroyed his life. The feeling of relief was so intense he nearly collapsed right there in his cell, realizing that his long fight for truth had finally found its moment of victory. Amanda Foster wasted no time transforming her discovery into a journalistic bombshell that would shake Cedar Falls' entire power structure. The story she published wasn't just about Anthony's innocence, but about the entire corruption network that had allowed this injustice to happen. She exposed the witnesses' lies, evidence manipulation, intimidation of public officials, and Detective Rodriguez's forced transfer. It was a devastating portrait of how power and influence could corrupt even the institutions that should protect citizens. The repercussions were immediate and overwhelming. State and national newspapers picked up the story, civil rights activists mobilized, and public pressure became impossible to ignore. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing all the indignation that had been building for months. Anthony watched all of this with a mixture of relief and satisfaction, finally seeing the truth come to light in a way that no one could deny or suppress. Media pressure forced a new federal investigation, conducted by agents who had no ties to local politics and were determined to get to the bottom of the truth. It was like watching real justice in action, different from the farce that had been staged in previous months. Federal investigators quickly discovered that Anthony's case was just the tip of the iceberg of a much broader corruption operation, involving inflated public contracts, money laundering, and a network of favors that had kept the Harrisons in power for decades. Bradley was arrested in a spectacular operation, broadcast live on television, where he was taken from yet another of his parties in handcuffs, in front of all the friends who had lied to protect him. The irony was delicious. The young man who had boasted about destroying an innocent's life now faced the consequences of his own crimes. Anthony watched Bradley's arrest from his cell and felt not exactly revenge, but deep satisfaction at seeing justice finally being done. Mayor Robert Harrison, realizing his protection network had completely crumbled, attempted one last desperate move by resigning for health reasons, hoping to escape legal consequences. But it was too late. The federal investigation had gathered enough evidence to prosecute not only Bradley for the original crime, but the entire Harrison family for corruption, obstruction of justice, and a series of other crimes they had committed over the years. It was like watching the fall of an empire built on lies and injustices, seeing the powerful finally being held accountable for their actions. The city of Cedar Falls watched all of this with a mixture of shock and relief, finally realizing the extent of corruption that had dominated their lives for so long. For Anthony, it was confirmation that his fight had been worth it, that his refusal to accept injustice had exposed a rot much greater than he had ever imagined. Anthony's release was a moment of pure catharsis, not just for him, but for the entire community that had followed his struggle. When the prison doors opened and he walked toward freedom, there were hundreds of people waiting for him. Neighbors, schoolmates, workers like him who had identified with his fight against injustice. It was like a celebration of good triumphing over evil, truth over lies, justice over corruption. Amelia was there, with tears in her eyes and a smile that lit up her entire face, finally able to hug her son without prison bars between them. It was a moment of redemption not just for Anthony, but for all those who had believed in him when it seemed impossible. The feeling of relief was so intense it seemed unreal, as if it were a dream from which he might wake up at any moment. But it was real. It was true. It was justice finally prevailing after months of nightmare. The positive consequences of Anthony's victory spread far beyond his personal freedom. Detective Rodriguez was not only reinstated to her position, but promoted and put in charge of leading a task force against police corruption. Amanda Foster won journalism awards for her courageous investigation and became a respected voice in the fight against injustice. Jake Miller, ashamed of his initial cowardice, became an activist for the rights of vulnerable youth. It was as if Anthony's struggle had inspired a wave of positive changes that transformed the entire community. The city of Cedar Falls underwent a moral renewal, with new leaders being elected and new policies being implemented to ensure transparency and justice. Anthony had become not just a symbol of resistance, but a catalyst for social transformation. The end of the story brought an unexpected and inspiring twist when Anthony received a full scholarship from a prestigious university that had followed his case through the media. It was as if the universe was finally compensating for all the suffering he had endured, offering him not just the chance to fulfill his original dream, but to do so in an even grander way than he had imagined. Anthony decided to study law, determined to become the type of lawyer he would have liked to have had during his ordeal. Someone who fought for the wronged, who defended the oppressed, who ensured that stories like his wouldn't be repeated. It was a complete transformation. The young man who had been a victim of injustice would now dedicate himself to fighting it professionally. His personal experience had given him a unique understanding of the legal system's flaws and an unshakable motivation to correct them. Anthony Smith, who had started as a simple gas station worker, was about to become a powerful force in the fight for justice, proving that sometimes the greatest victories are born from the greatest adversities. Anthony Smith's story teaches us a powerful lesson about the nature of justice and corruption in our society. It shows us that behind the respectable facade of many communities, there can exist a network of lies and manipulations that protects the powerful at the expense of the innocent. But it also reveals something even more important, that truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to surface when brave people refuse to accept injustice. Anthony wasn't just a young man fighting for his own freedom. He became a symbol of resistance against a corrupt system that believed it could silence any voice that dared question it. What's most impressive about this story is how one person's determination can trigger a wave of changes that transforms an entire community. Anthony could have accepted the plea deal, could have resigned himself to the fate others had chosen for him, but his refusal to surrender inspired others to fight for truth. Detective Rodriguez risked her career, Amanda Foster faced threats, and even Jake Miller found courage to do what was right. It's proof that justice isn't just the responsibility of institutions, but of each of us who refuses to remain silent in the face of injustice. Anthony's transformation, from a young worker to a future lawyer dedicated to defending the oppressed, symbolizes something much greater than a personal victory. It represents humanity's capacity to transform suffering into purpose, to use pain as fuel to create a more just world. His journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are born from the greatest adversities, and that those who face injustice head-on can become the most powerful voices in the fight for truth. Cedar Falls wasn't just the scene of a crime crime and its resolution, it was the setting for a moral renewal that proved no corrupt system is strong enough to resist the force of truth when it finally comes to light. This story touches something deep within all of us because we've all felt, at some point, the bitter taste of injustice or witnessed someone being treated unfairly because of their social position. If this narrative touched your heart, if it made you reflect on the power of truth and perseverance, share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that it's worth fighting for what's right. Hit that like button if you believe stories like this need to be told, and subscribe to the channel for more content that shows how justice can prevail even in the most difficult circumstances. Because sometimes the right message arrives exactly when someone needs to hear that it's never too late to fight for the truth.